Hello there. This video will be released on the morning of the 23rd of May, and that's the release date for my novel Hill 112, a novel of D-Day and the Battle for Normandy. So I thought I'd say a few things about the book and also talk about D-Day and why D-Day is important and why we remember it. So the book, first of all, the Hill 112, as other videos will have explained a little bit, it's the story focused around three former schoolmates. They've all been to the same little prep school in a small town on the Bristol Channel in South Wales. They end up in the army in different roles. Two of them are in the same infantry battalion, one in the ranks, one commanding a platoon. Another one is a commander of a troop of Sherman tanks in an armoured regiment. So we get to see D-Day itself, though only one of them will land in France on D-Day. The other two are in a camp waiting to go and are still in that great long process of training and practicing and preparing and wondering, is it going to be now and how are we going to cope and all this sort of thing. That was really the experience of so many Allied soldiers, particularly in the British and Canadian armies in the years building up to D-Day itself, waiting around in Britain for something to happen and preparing for it, but not quite knowing when it's going to happen and how things are going to work out. So I wanted a little bit of that experience, but we've also got James, the Sherman tank troop commander, will land on Gold Beach on D-Day itself and then be pushing inland. This is a story of D-Day itself, but also of the Battle for Normandy that in fact lasted for the best part of 2.5 months, well into August, after the D-Day landings. And it's the story told from the perspective of a tank crew facing much heavier German tanks, but also country that concealed the enemy. The infantryman with a Panzerfaust, a bazooka, I suppose an early RPG to some extent, is as much a threat, perhaps even more of a threat, than the famous Tiger tank that can pot you from a mile away, because it's no good if you can't see someone who's 10, 20, 30 yards away. So it's their experience, it's the experience of the infantry soldiers who are advancing through wheat fields, cornfields as they go, being shelled, mortared, machine gunned, moving towards an objective, trying to keep up with the barrage, a sense of what it was like. That's the idea behind the book, to give people some idea, as far as you can, of what that experience meant to those youngsters and everybody else who was caught up in it all. So it's not a history of big battles. It's not about the strategy to any great degree. They get glimpses of this, but the perspective is always that of people at fairly low levels, at junior levels, the worm's eye view. And literally so sometimes when you've got one of the characters clinging to the ground, as close pressing for dear life, because they're trying to make themselves small in the hope that that will save them when they're under shell fire. It's about danger. This is a very, very costly campaign, a very costly battle that was attritional. Essentially the Allies are attacking again and again, and they're making little headway because the Germans are defending very, very well and with great determination, and it's costly for both sides. The armies are being worn away literally, and that's part of that experience that perhaps the drama of D-Day itself doesn't necessarily give us. So this is what I wanted to do. The whole book is written from the point of view of these three. Occasionally we glimpse it through the eyes of others, but essentially it's very much what was going on around them, what they could see, what they knew, what people were telling them to do, what they were sometimes telling others to do, the confusion, the chaos, the fear, the excitement, the boredom at times. But the idea is to try and immerse you in that, give you a sense as if you were there. You are seeing this and experiencing this through these youngsters, and how they're coping, sometimes failing to cope, trying to do their best, trying to understand what's going on, trying to manage, trying to stay alive. So I've done my very best to draw upon all the memoirs, all the accounts, all the people I've listened to over the years, condense that into a format that makes it easier. And when somebody writes their memoirs, they will often be a little more restrained, and they want to upset relatives, particularly of those who died. In a novel, because everyone's fictional, you can step back from that a little bit. I haven't made it deliberately nightmarish. On the other hand, there was enough of a nightmare about the real thing to make that a strong element of it. Some of this is we're talking about terrible things for anybody to go through, let alone these kids that went off to fight in Normandy, and they won in Normandy. And they're now, the last few are very elderly men, and there are fewer and fewer of them every year. And by the time the commemorations come around in a few weeks' time, there will be a few veterans, but the ranks compared to 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20 or more, just get thinner and thinner. So this was the idea, as that generation passes, to give an easy way in to getting a sense of what it was like. So that's the purpose of the book. So there's more in some of the other videos. I'll start off, now the book's out, I can start talking a little bit more about some of the incidents in it, and particularly how I depict tank warfare, the way the Sherman tank troop functions, but also how the infantry battalion, the infantry rifle platoons do their thing, and other aspects of the nature of the fighting in Normandy that pop up in the novel, and that I've tried to put in incidents that are interesting as well as typical experiences, that mixture of the strange and the technical side. So we'll do that sort of thing. But for today, I just thought, I was asked recently to write a little article on why we remember D-Day. And I'm not going to go through all of that and repeat the same arguments, but it is interesting how it's come to symbolise so much. Now, there is a tendency for any past event to get simplified in the popular memory. I suppose, Crimean War, what's that now? It used to be, in my day, it was Florence Nightingale and the Charge of the Light Brigade, probably in the other order. Now I'm not so sure whether the school kids read Tennyson in the way that we did back in the day. And judging from my son's school, they talk a lot about Mary Seacole as well as Florence Nightingale. That's basically, the Crimean War is more about hospitals and dealing with the wounded and the sick than necessarily the fighting. Now, obviously, the Crimean War is a very distant event, wasn't a major conflict compared to, say, the Napoleonic Wars or Waterloo, something like that. Yet, nevertheless, given that we've seen a Russian occupation of Crimea, it's now part of Russia rather than Ukraine, at least at the moment, physically. I'll probably get into trouble for saying that from various political lobby groups, but that's the de facto situation at the moment. We've got the ongoing war in Ukraine. You would think, in a sense, that past British involvement in the same area would be something of interest to people, but it's not. I mean, there are ways the popular imagination or the media works. When British troops went back into Afghanistan and Iraq, there was almost nothing in the wider media about earlier imperial adventures in those areas. Probably would have been wise had there been, just to explain the situation, because other people remember this, and many of the locals do. So it's significant and it's important and it happened. But there is a tendency to simplify past events. Waterloo, now the prime example, became a very sort of clear, Victorian, simple story, at least from the British perspective, much of which isn't necessarily based on anything that's too reliable, and often stories that were told by somebody who wasn't there, but who claimed to have heard it from someone who was, grew into the sort of orthodox version of it all. So, more recently, think of the First World War. In the popular imagination now, that's simply mud, trenches, rats, pointless attacks, walking forward very slowly to be machine gunned. It's basically every battle is the first day of the Somme, but the first day of the Somme fought not in those chalky, largely untouched up until that point, landscapes. Everything is Passchendaele, everything is sucking mud, everything is a wasteland. And you can see it, there was the sort of the German Euro version of it in that recent film version of on Netflix of All Quiet on the Western Front. Utter stereotype that bears very little relation to what was going on at the time that story is set, and the great variation in the different battles. Things did happen, things did change during those years of war, and you didn't spend weeks and months after months in the trenches. You spent short periods and then in the reserves and then resting. But the idea is, it's sort of the Blackadder Goes Forth, which was great fun as a series, but not meant to be history, and unfortunately sometimes people take it as such, where they're basically sitting in their same trench year after year. At least that's the idea that's given, and that's that wasn't what the First World War was actually like. It's a caricature of it. Often you take, as with Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, you take real people or real events like the Charge of the Light Brigade, and they then expand to become the whole thing. Because unless people bother to take an interest, they don't really know anything more than that. And it's odd how these selections are made. The Second World War obviously has that similar tendency, because it's a huge conflict globally, waged on so many different fronts, so many different theatres. The Chinese perspective on it is understandably profoundly different to the Russian one, to the British one, to the French one, to the American one, to the German one, to the Italian one, because it depended what your experience was and your involvement. D-Day has very much emerged as one of the big moments of the Second World War, and that probably happened very, very quickly, almost at the time, and certainly very soon in the aftermath of the war. Now, it's one of those oddities that it's very few events are known as a code word, basically, and as a convention. It's simply for staff planners. The Allies established that D would stand for day, T for time, so you can plan as to D-Day is when the operation actually begins, which, if you give a precise date, obviously, that might give the game away to the other side, but also, as with D-Day itself, for instance, the Normandy landings, they're postponed by 24 hours because of bad weather. But all the planning actually is based around, well, this is what's going to happen on the main day itself. D-1 is what's going to happen one day before, D+1 afterwards, D+10, 10 days afterwards, and so on. The same with time. It's a convention adopted by the Allies. It's one of those things that's been bugging me for ages, and if anybody knows, please put it in the comments. I'm sure I've read that the convention was one that the US Army had adopted and that the Allies agreed to adopt as the standard convention, and that the British Army hadn't done that up to that point, but I haven't looked at enough sort of operations orders and the like from, say, the First World War to know what they were doing then, how staff planned, what just the terminology was used. So that might be wrong, it might be my imagination. Where I thought I read it, I've gone back and I couldn't see it there, so I don't know. But nevertheless, it doesn't alter the principle. And of course, that means that there were an awful lot of D-Days during the course of the Second World War, because there's an awful lot of operations that occur on their set day. So I've just put up on the screen a cartoon that always springs to mind. If you've ever come across the cartoonist John, had his two types during the Second World War of these sort of 8th Army desert men, scruffy, determined, going through a lot, not necessarily the brightest sparks, but nevertheless, and there they are in the ever so not sunny Italy, as it was the experience of so many Allied soldiers there from 43 onwards, talking about, there was that, again, it's unclear whether or not the MP in question actually used the expression and why she used it that way, but that D-Day dodgers was applied to the men serving in Italy, that they'd somehow, weren't helping to the grand invasion, the Second Front in Europe. And, it's which D-Day do they mean, old man? And they've got on their jeep, Alamein, Mareth, Sicily, Italy, Salerno, Anzio. Because again, these, there are people who've been fighting longer and who are going through operation after operation, each with its own D-Day. So it's one of those odd things that rather than calling it the invasion or even, Overlord or Normandy, D-Day has become remembered as the D-Day. To the extent where you'll even find, I think they did it in Masters of the Air, they were talking about when D-Day's coming, rather than when's the Second Front, when's the invasion, because they know the audience will know what they mean. And you had obviously you had Cornelius's Rhine, The Longest Day, and then the movie based around it, which of course again is called something different, but it's about that invasion. D-Day is well established. The Normandy landings, June the 6th, on the 5 beaches, are pretty well known even today, as memory of the Second World War is fading in Western countries, other than those who are interested and want to do so. And hopefully the commemorations and things like that will help to slow this process, but there is a danger that the Second World War will become as caricatured as the First World War is now in so many people's imagination. And more recently, films like Saving Private Ryan and the like, with those immensely powerful Omaha sequences that basically the rest of the film never manages to top, because how could you? That's so well done that it's powerful, and it's reasonable representation of what happened on large parts of Omaha Beach. And they're obviously dealing with a specific sector and part of the one of the Ranger battalions, and then from the 29th Division. It's compressed in time. The scene is really long by cinematic standards, but lasts, 20-25 minutes, something like that, whereas it took hours for the events that they depict to develop in that way. But nevertheless, if you're going to take imagery from a fictional portrayal on screen, then that's not a bad sense of what some parts of the D-Day beaches were like, and particularly large parts of Omaha. And that's reinforced that sense of D-Day as important. The thing is, obviously, is that it is important, and it was. When the Allies landed in Normandy, yes, there'd been troops in Italy for some time, but Churchill's talk of a soft underbelly and all this sort of thing proved to be woefully misplaced. The chances of advancing up through that terrain, with the Germans always having the high ground, watching, looking down on you, and with their spotters, you've only got to go to Italy, travel along it, and think whoever thought this was a good idea that you could rush up along this peninsula in a short time, and then get across the mountains, and then start to threaten Austria in the night. It was always going to be a hard slog once the Germans chose to fight there, and particularly as they fought to delay. But after June the 6th, the war will end in May the following year. So less than a year it will take for the Allies to complete the defeat of Nazi Germany, and then a few months later they'll be able to complete the defeat of Japan. So D-Day matters. I think I might have even used this in the article. Famously Winston Churchill talked about the Battle of El Alamein as not the end, not even the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. In a sense, D-Day is perhaps the beginning of the end. Once it has got ashore, once the Allies have established themselves in Normandy and the Germans failed to throw them back into the sea, and they're never really that at all close to doing that. They don't get organised for reasons that the Allies stop them from getting organised. Among other things, there are lots of other aspects. Then the Germans are going to lose. The Allies will eventually come in. You've got the Russians coming a month or so after D-Day. Operation Bagration opens on the Eastern Front and sweeps through Army Group Centre, partly because the reserves, the panzer units that might have stopped it, are there fighting the British, Canadians and Americans in Normandy. They're not there to stop the Russians, and that's the whole point. Normandy is an Allied victory shown by the number of different nations and nationalities involved. It's the last time really the British are anything like an equal partner on land, and even that by the end of the Battle of Normandy, the numbers are going inexorably upwards for the Americans and down for the British, to the point where they are very much the junior partner by the latter stages of the war. You could pretend they weren't, still in June 1944, and with a fair degree of justification. So D-Day matters. D-Day does bring the end of the war closer, and it leads to that. Those consequences that follow from it means that Hitler is going to lose, Germany is going to be invaded from both sides. When? That's another matter. That depends on so many decisions, so many factors, the logistics of it all, the numbers, the tactics, but it's going to happen. So D-Day matters. D-Day was really important. And again, it's why not remember it as just the conventional name as D-Day itself. It wasn't the only D-Day. It has become that now, particularly in the wider imagination. But it is part of that bigger victory. D-Day occurs, the Normandy landings are possible because the Allies by that time have prevailed in the Battle of the Atlantic, although the Battle of the Atlantic will not stop until the war itself stops. It begins right at the start of the war and it goes all the way through. Again, if you want a sort of easy access to it, then things like films like The Cruel Sea or the recent Tom Hanks Greyhound are very good, giving you a sense of that convoy experience. But the troops that crossed the English Channel to get to Normandy had to be supplied, fed, equipped, and in many cases, the Americans, the Canadians, and many others came over the seas to get to Britain, and they came by sea. And if the U-boats were sinking too many of the ships that came, then this wouldn't have been possible. So that's made it possible. The strategic bombing campaign has made D-Day possible because it's worn down the Luftwaffe, and particularly in the sort of big week battles early in 1944, as the Americans by day, the RAF by night, have weakened German industry. They didn't, as the bomber barons proclaimed, they didn't destroy it, they didn't win the war on their own, but they did make it far more difficult for the German army and the German armed forces to wage war. They reduced the power of the Luftwaffe. That was done in even more dramatic fashion by the 8th Air Force and its supporting fighter escorts in the early months of 1944, by shooting down the Luftwaffe in such great numbers that it meant that while every now and again, it's surprising how often in memoirs you do come across people who note seeing a German aircraft or being flown over or strafed by a German aircraft in Normandy, because it was obviously something they felt was worth mentioning, because it wasn't actually that common. It's one of those sort of strange things. They mention it because, oh yeah, I saw one of those, not because these are very unfamiliar, rather shocking things, in a way they weren't, say, in the earlier campaigns in Sicily and Italy, or in the Desert War, or let alone in Greece or Crete, France, that sort of thing. Everything is playing a part. The economic strength of the Allied nations is playing a part. The fact that the Soviet army has killed far more German soldiers than the Western Allies ever will. That Titanic-scaled conflict waged from Operation Barbarossa onwards. All of these things contribute. Without them, D-Day is not the thing that on its own wins the war, because it's too big a war to have any one event like that does this. So it's part of it, it's part of a bigger story. And sometimes, I think in Britain, people still remember the Battle of Britain. They sort of remember, through the dam busters as much as anything, remember Bomber Command. So the RAF gets a bit of is still in the popular consciousness. Not so sure about the Navy. I think for anyone with any enthusiasm, anyone who likes the older war films, things like The Cruel Sea and Sink the Bismarck and all these sorts of things, that's still there. And there's enough families still with a naval tradition to remember that. But it's the Battle of the Atlantic, because it doesn't focus on dramatic events. It's so many small engagements. And even though the cost, the merchant navy suffers the highest proportional rate of anybody involved from Britain's point of view in the Second World War, more merchant seamen die. That's partly because obviously they don't have the sort of logistic tail, they don't have the people, but given that they're not actually an armed force, and that's also the rather cruel thing that when your ship is sunk, your pay stops as well. So if you survive in an open boat or get picked up by the Navy or a rescue ship, you're not getting paid again until you sign up next time round. I think people have some memory of that, and they have some memory of U-boats, but it's less focused. And obviously something else that's come into the popular imagination since they revealed the Ultra Secret a few decades back is Bletchley Park and the Code Breakers, and of course you've had films like Enigma about Alan Turing and all this sort of thing, TV series and the like, and this sort of sense of cleverness. Now that's part of the story of the war as well, and Ultra was important, and the ingenuity of the deception plans before Operation Overlord, before the Normandy landings, that convinced the Germans we were going for the Pas-de-Calais, created this fictional army group under Patton in the southeast, made threats to Norway, and distracted them for a long time after June the 6th as well. So this all worked. They turned the German spies, all this sort of stuff, or earlier on, the man who never was stuff, all that sort of thing. Ingenuity, spies, prisoners of war have become a big thing of the sort of British memory of the Second World War, partly because of movies like Colditz Story and the Colditz television series and Great Escape and all this sort of thing. I think we have D-Day, and then we have, partly because of their importance, but also because of the prevalence of American culture, we remember D-Day in particular because, again, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, things like that have helped us to focus on certain incidents. And then Battle of the Bulge we know about, even though British are involved, but less directly. That, you know, it's overwhelmingly an American battle and an American victory, although the British do support and they do what allies should do. But the bulk of the fighting is done by GIs. So we've got that sense. I think the battle for Normandy itself has been forgotten a little bit in the wider imagination. Not those people who are enthusiasts, obviously. You know, there's still, you look at any bookshop, see a history section, there's usually then a military history section. It's the first subdivision you'll get. There's going to be a lot of Second World War stuff, and there's going to be a lot of stuff with this. So there's plenty of people out there that are interested. I'm hoping that this book, this novel, Hill 112, that I'll finally come back to after rambling for 36 hours or whatever it's been, will interest the enthusiasts, will interest the people who already know something, and sometimes maybe we'll give them a new perspective, or we'll tell them some of the things I learned that I've put in that I thought, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know that. But also that sense of immediacy, trying to put yourself in the place of what it was like to be there, really, of the men who were there. But also I hope it will appeal to those who know far, far less, and give them a taste that maybe expands their sense of what the Second World War, what D-Day, what Normandy was all about. It's not meant, I'm very much doing a cameo. You know, this is one section. These are three individuals, their experiences within this one aspect of one battle in Normandy. I can't deal with the Canadians or the Americans or other British units in any sort of detail. You know, you get no sense of the experience of the parachute troops, the glider troops, that sort of thing. You don't get much sense really of what the Navy's experience was, or the Air Force, you know, flying air support. You're not going to get a sense of Operation Bagration or the experience of the Eastern Front. You're not going to get the sense of Monte Cassino, what's going on in Italy, or, you know, it's already played out by now, but Burma, you know, the developments there. This is a few individuals, so this is again just adding an extra bit and maybe a bit more detail to one of these sort of big blocks around which our memory focuses for events like the Second World War. So that's the purpose of the book, to give you a sense of a time, of a place, of an experience, of the horrors, of the excitement, of the fear, of you know, the humour, the comradeship as well, but also that being shut in on yourself, because yes, you draw support from those around you, but in the end there's so much going on in your head. So that's the idea. I've tried to make it as accurate as I possibly can. I think it's is readable, approachable. Like anything else, the style will be something you either like or you don't. There's not much I can do about that. I've written, as I always do, the sort of book I'd really like to read and that no one else has written yet. Doesn't seem to be there, therefore I thought, well, I'll do this because it interests me, and I'm just hoping that lots of other people share that interest and enjoy it as well. But there we go, Hill 112, released today, available in hardback, it's available in ebook, there'll be a paperback come the end of the year. I think the hardback will eventually be available in the United States as well, although at the moment I think it's just the Kindle version is maybe there, but perhaps Barnes & Noble and others have got the hardback, I'm not quite sure, but it should in due course be able, you can order the physical book as well as the e-version. So anyway, thanks for listening, and you know, hope people enjoy the book.